marry me tonight?
What? You don't even know me!
Young Millionaire rushed into marriage with a homeless girl, not realizing she was. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask a quick favor. Please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss any of our channel's new videos. It's fast, it's free, and it's the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means everything to us. Where are you tuning in from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The night hung heavy, almost suffocating within the confines of the Reynolds family's grand estate. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like 1,000 stars above the flawlessly polished marble floors, and the air was thick with the sweet scent of roses imported all the way from France. Yet for Alexander Reynolds, the young and privileged heir to the billion-dollar empire, it felt more like an opulent prison than a home. Guests, all impeccably dressed in tailored suits and shimmering gowns, raised their champagne glasses in unison, their voices a low hum of congratulations for his impending marriage to the daughter of another equally wealthy and powerful dynasty. But beneath the practiced, charming smile he wore for their benefit, Alexander's chest ached with a burning defiance. This marriage wasn't about love, connection, or even mutual respect. It was a cold, calculated transaction, purely about consolidating power, maintaining the family's pristine reputation, and exerting absolute control. He had argued relentlessly, pleaded with every ounce of sincerity he possessed, and even threatened to walk away from the entire family fortune, a threat that would cripple most men, but it did little to sway his parents' unwavering decision. Tonight marked the engagement dinner, a lavish affair designed to impress, and tomorrow would bring the official announcement to the press, solidifying his fate in the eyes of the world. Alexander's life had already been meticulously planned, mapped out in intricate contracts and suffocating obligations. His future was nothing more than a pawn in a ruthless game of social dominance, and he refused to accept it. So, he made a choice. A daring, impulsive, almost reckless decision. He slipped away from the glittering ballroom, escaping unnoticed into the cool night air. The night air was crisp and sharp against his skin, carrying the distant sound of traffic humming beyond the tall, imposing iron gates that marked the boundary of his gilded cage. His personal driver had parked the limousine nearby, ready to whisk him away at a moment's notice. But Alexander didn't head toward it. He kept walking, deliberately shedding his expensively tailored jacket, loosening his restricting tie, moving faster with each step, as if he were trying to outrun the crushing weight of his own prestigious surname. His highly polished shoes scuffed unceremoniously against the rough, unforgiving pavement as he deliberately left the estate far behind and ventured into the dim, unfamiliar streets of the city. That was when he saw her, a young woman sitting alone on the sidewalk near a bus stop, drawing her knees up to her chest in a futile attempt to ward off the biting cold. Her clothes were worn and faded, her sneakers were frayed and torn, bearing the marks of a hard life. Beside her rested a battered duffel bag, its canvas faded and stained, and a paper cup containing only a scattering of loose coins. She slowly lifted her head, sensing someone's presence nearby. Her eyes were tired, etched with a weariness that belied her youth, yet there was also a spark in them, a flicker of something stubborn, alive, and unbroken. "Sorry," she muttered quickly, averting her gaze as though fully expecting to be ignored, or worse, reprimanded. People in expensive suits usually just walk past without even a glance. But Alexander stopped. For a brief, almost surreal moment, the cacophony of his world, the relentless expectations, the suffocating weight of wealth, the demanding obligations, all faded into a profound silence. He saw her not as a nameless stranger, not as a faceless statistic in the city's vast underbelly, but simply as a human being, struggling to survive a night that had offered her nothing but hardship. He crouched down, lowering himself to her level, his voice soft and low, almost incredulous at the impulsive thought that was rapidly forming in his mind. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if unused to being asked. "Emma." "Emma," he repeated, the name feeling strange yet somehow right on his lips. He glanced at her worn duffel bag, her thin jacket offering little protection against the frigid air. And then he asked the question that stunned even himself. "What if you married me?" Emma blinked, momentarily certain she had misheard him, her mind struggling to process the absurdity of the proposition. She let out a short, involuntary laugh, a sound that was half amusement and half disbelief, shaking her head slowly. Is this some kind of joke? But Alexander's gaze was unwavering, intense, almost pleading. "I'm serious," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "I need a wife tonight. Not tomorrow, not in a year. Tonight. In return, you'll never have to sleep on the street again. You'll have a roof over your head, food to eat, safety and security. All I ask is that you sign a contract and play the role." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She had survived hunger, rejection, loneliness, and countless nights colder than this one. But nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment. For a millionaire in an impeccably tailored suit, kneeling on a grimy city sidewalk, asking her to marry him. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to disappear into the shadows before this strange, surreal encounter took an even stranger turn. Yet something in his eyes, something vulnerable, almost broken, made her pause, hesitating at the edge of the abyss. In that fragile, improbable moment, two lives that should never have crossed paths began to collide, their destinies intertwining in the most unexpected way. And neither of them knew that this reckless decision, made under the flickering, unreliable glow of a streetlight, would unravel secrets far deeper and more dangerous than either of them could possibly imagine, all because Alexander Reynolds mistakenly thought she was just a homeless girl. But Emma carried a hidden truth, a secret she had guarded fiercely, a truth that Alexander could never have predicted in his wildest dreams. The silence that followed Alexander's reckless proposal seemed to stretch on forever, each second amplifying the absurdity of the situation. Emma stared at him, her mind racing, unsure whether to burst out laughing at the sheer improbability of it all, or to simply run away as fast as her legs could carry her from what felt like a descent into madness. But his eyes remained locked on hers, unwavering in their intensity. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no hint of a playful joke, only a palpable urgency, as if this impulsive decision held more weight and significance than life itself. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's hum, her words trembling slightly from the lingering chill. "Because you have nothing to gain and nothing to lose," Alexander replied, his voice low and serious. "And that makes you the only person I can trust." His words resonated within her, sinking into her chest like a heavy stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of confusion and disbelief. Emma had lived an invisible existence for months, brushed aside by indifferent strangers, systematically overlooked by society, deemed unworthy of even a passing glance. Now, suddenly, a man in an immaculate suit, a man who represented everything she was not only looking at her, truly seeing her, but also choosing her, singling her out as if she were the only solution to his desperate, impossible puzzle. Emma's lips trembled, betraying the turmoil within. "You don't know me," she whispered, her voice laced with doubt. You don't even know if I'm a good person." Alexander gave a short, humorless laugh, a sound that spoke volumes about his own disillusionment. "Good," he echoed, the word tinged with bitterness. "My entire world is filled with people who claim to be good, people who project an image of virtue and morality, while secretly hiding knives behind their backs, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. You," he paused, his eyes flickering down to her threadbare jacket, the pathetic paper cup filled with a few measly coins, and then back up to the raw, unfiltered honesty in her gaze. "You're real. That's all I need." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and uncertainty. She knew she should walk away, protect herself from whatever game this wealthy, desperate man was playing. Yet, when he extended his hand, trembling almost imperceptibly despite his carefully cultivated composure, Emma found her own fingers moving almost against her will, sliding hesitantly into his palms. The next hour passed in a blur, a disorienting montage of fragmented images and sensations, a hurried cab ride through the city's neon-lit streets, the faint, lingering smell of leather seats and expensive cologne, the kaleidoscopic glow of neon signs streaking across the rain-streaked glass as the urban landscape rushed past in a dizzying panorama. Alexander sat beside her in a tense silence, his jaw tight and rigid, his phone buzzing relentlessly in his pocket, a constant reminder of the world he had temporarily abandoned. He resolutely ignored it. Emma clutched her worn duffel bag, as if it were her only anchor, her only connection to the life she knew. Desperately trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had suddenly engulfed her, wondering how her life had shifted so violently and irrevocably in a single, improbable evening. They arrived at a small, unassuming chapel tucked away between a row of shuttered storefronts, a forgotten oasis of quiet in the heart of the bustling city. The old pastor, a kind-faced man with gentle eyes, blinked in confusion at the unexpected sight of the well-dressed young man and the girl with the weary eyes and tattered clothes. Yet Alexander's unwavering determination and quiet authority quickly smoothed away any lingering questions or doubts. Papers were signed with hands that shook, not with excitement or anticipation, but with the immense weight of consequence. A ring, cheap silver, the kind one might find in a dusty corner of a pawn shop, slid onto Emma's finger, a poor imitation of a diamond. But in that surreal moment, it felt undeniably binding. "Do you take him?" the pastor asked, his voice soft and reverent. Emma's voice caught in her throat, choked with a mixture of fear and disbelief. But she forced the words out, her voice barely a whisper. "I do." "And do you take her?" The pastor turned to Alexander. Alexander's reply came instantly, without hesitation, like a man seizing the last available rope before being dragged under by a powerful current. "I do." The small chapel echoed with silence after the brief, perfunctory vows. No choir, no formally dressed guests, no celebratory applause. Only two strangers, bound together by a hastily made choice, a desperate pact that promised to upend both of their lives in ways they could not yet comprehend. When they stepped back outside, into the cool night air, the city felt different, altered by the weight of what had just transpired. The night air pressed colder against her skin, but the crushing weight on Alexander's chest seemed to have lifted, replaced by a strange, almost reckless sense of hope. He had done it. He had defied his family, broken free from the chains of their suffocating expectations. He had a wife, unexpected, unpolished, utterly unlike anyone they would have chosen for him, but undeniably his. Beside him, Emma stared down at the cheap silver ring on her finger, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She desperately wanted to believe that this was safety, that the promise of shelter, food, and security was real and lasting. But fear still gnawed at her, whispering doubts in the back of her mind. What if this was all a mistake? What if this was just another trap? Another cruel joke played by the wealthy elite, a game she didn't understand and couldn't possibly win. As if sensing the turmoil of her thoughts, Alexander spoke softly, his voice carrying a note of reassurance. "From this moment on, you're not alone. I'll keep my word." Emma's throat tightened, making it difficult to speak. She nodded slowly, though uncertainty still shadowed her gaze, clouding the fragile hope that had begun to blossom within her. Neither of them knew just how dangerous the road ahead would be, how many obstacles they would have to overcome, how many secrets would be revealed. Alexander had defied his family, and the Reynolds empire was not known for forgiving rebellion or disobedience. They would fight back, using every resource at their disposal to reclaim their control. And Emma carried secrets buried deeper than the city's darkest midnight streets, secrets that, if revealed, could shatter everything. For now, they walked together into the unknown. Two mismatched souls, stitched together by a contract that pretended to be marriage, a fragile bond forged in desperation. Yet, with every step they took, the line between pretense and reality blurred a little more, their carefully constructed facade threatened by something deeper, something real. The mansion loomed in the distance like a formidable fortress as the sleek black limousine glided up the long, winding driveway. Emma pressed her face against the cool glass of the window, staring in wide-eyed disbelief at the seemingly endless rows of meticulously trimmed hedges, the elegant fountains illuminated by golden floodlights, and the massive double doors carved with the intricate Reynolds family crest. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat of apprehension. She had never set foot in a place like this before, not even as a guest, and now she was expected to walk through those imposing doors as the wife of the heir, a role she was woefully unprepared to play. Alexander sensed the tension radiating from her, the palpable fear that she was trying to conceal. He gently adjusted his tie, his voice low and controlled, offering a measure of comfort. "Remember," he said, his gaze steady and reassuring, "you don't owe them your fear. You're my wife now. They can't erase that." Emma nodded slowly, trying to absorb his words, though her white-knuckled grip on her worn duffel bag betrayed her inner turmoil. Inside, the mansion practically breathed wealth, an opulent display of extravagance that seemed almost obscene. Marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the light from countless crystal chandeliers that dripped with sparkling prisms like frozen rain. A dozen or more uniformed staff members stood rigidly at attention, their eyes darting discreetly between Alexander and the girl clinging nervously to his side, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled judgment. The air was thick with unspoken criticism. "Welcome home, sir," the butler said, his voice perfectly modulated, bowing slightly in deference. His gaze flicked almost imperceptibly toward Emma, pausing just long enough to deliver a subtle, stinging insult. "And madam." Emma forced a small, polite smile, clutching her bag even tighter, feeling the weight of their scrutiny like a physical burden. Every whispered comment from the staff, every sidelong glance, felt like a sharp blade against her skin. She had survived hunger, hardship, and countless nights spent huddled under bridges, exposed to the elements. But this silent scorn, this impalpable disdain cut far deeper, inflicting a pain she had never known before. Alexander led her up the grand staircase, his hand gently guiding her forward. "This is your room," he said, his voice matter-of-fact, opening a door to reveal a chamber that was larger and more lavish than any apartment she had ever dreamed of, a space that seemed almost impossibly luxurious. The enormous bed was covered in shimmering satin sheets. The windows were draped in heavy velvet curtains that shut out the world, and the air was filled with the subtle scent of expensive perfume. Emma's throat tightened, making it difficult to breathe. "This room could probably fit every shelter I've ever stayed in," she whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. "All in one space." Alexander's eyes softened slightly, a flicker of something akin to empathy crossing his face, but his tone remained brisk and businesslike. "Get some rest," he said, turning to leave. "Tomorrow will be difficult." When he had gone, Emma sat heavily on the edge of the bed, pulling her worn sketchbook from her battered duffel bag, her most prized possession. She flipped through the pages, stopping at a drawing she had sketched just last night under the faint glow of a flickering street lamp. It was a simple drawing, a small house with a welcoming porch, flowers blooming in the front yard, and the faint suggestion of children's laughter etched in delicate pencil lines. A dream she had always carried within her heart, a vision of a life filled with warmth and happiness, a dream she had never thought anyone else would ever see. She held the sketchbook close to her chest, whispering fiercely to herself, "Don't lose who you are. Don't let them change you." Morning arrived with sunlight streaming through the tall arched windows, casting long shadows across the opulent room. Emma was led to the formal breakfast room, where a table stretched longer than any dining hall she had ever seen, a gleaming surface laden with platters of fresh fruit, silver pots filled with steaming coffee, and trays of pastries still warm from the oven. She sat awkwardly, unsure which fork to use, feeling completely out of place until Alexander entered the room, looking impeccably composed in a perfectly tailored suit. His mother, a woman of formidable elegance and sharp, assessing eyes, was already seated at the head of the table. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow at Emma, her gaze cool and appraising. "So," she said, her voice dripping with thinly veiled disdain, "this is the girl you chose?" Emma swallowed hard, feeling her throat constrict with nervousness. She wanted to answer politely, to offer some kind of explanation, but every word seemed to dry up in her throat, leaving her speechless. Alexander's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "This is my wife," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And she deserves your respect." "Oh," his mother replied, her lips curving into a cold, humorless smile. "Respect is earned, Alexander, not bought with a hasty signature." Her words hit Emma like a physical slap, the casual cruelty leaving her reeling. She stared down at her plate, forcing herself not to cry, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of seeing her break. After breakfast, Alexander walked her through the sprawling mansion, giving her a tour of their gilded cage. Every step they took echoed the vast gulf that separated them, highlighting their different worlds. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors glared down from ornate, gilded frames, their silent judgment adding to her unease. Staff members whispered behind their hands when they thought she couldn't hear them, their hushed conversations a constant reminder of her outsider status. She paused briefly by the entrance to the vast library, drawn to the towering shelves stacked high with leather-bound books, a veritable treasure trove of knowledge. She reached out and gently touched a spine, reverently caressing the worn leather, before realizing that Alexander was watching her, his expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "You like books?" he asked, his voice softening slightly. Emma gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "They were my escape when life was too heavy, when the world felt like it was closing in on me," she said softly. "Words can carry you to places your feet never could." For the first time since she had met him, Alexander's rigid mask seemed to crack, revealing a glimpse of something warmer, something more vulnerable beneath the surface. But before he could reply, a servant appeared, interrupting their moment with urgent news. The press had somehow caught wind of his sudden marriage, and photographers were gathering at the gates, clamoring for a glimpse of his mysterious bride. Alexander cursed under his breath, his anger palpable. "It begins," he muttered, his face hardening. Emma felt the weight of it all crashing down on her, the realization that her life would never be the same again. She was no longer invisible, no longer able to fade into the shadows. She was now the center of a media storm, a spectacle she had never asked for and was ill-equipped to handle. As the relentless flashes of cameras began to explode outside the iron gates, Alexander reached out and placed a steadying hand at the small of her back, offering silent support. "Stay beside me," he murmured, his voice firm but calm. "Whatever happens, we face it together." In that moment, Emma realized that the contract she had signed was more than just ink and paper. It was a lifeline, a means of survival for both of them. The storm of flashing cameras outside the iron gates did not abate, but only intensified. Reporters shouted a barrage of questions, their voices loud and demanding, microphones thrust forward as if they could pierce the iron bars themselves. Emma froze, her body stiff with fear, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the attention. On the streets, she had been invisible, a ghost flitting through the city's underbelly, a shadow that people hurried past without a second glance. Now, suddenly, every eye was on her, scrutinizing her every move, judging her clothes, dissecting her past, recording every detail for public consumption. Alexander leaned close, his voice a low murmur in her ear, firm but surprisingly calm. "Look at me. Not them," he instructed, his gaze unwavering. "Hold my hand." She obeyed, her fingers trembling as they intertwined with his, seeking comfort and strength in his touch. Together, they stepped forward, facing the onslaught, and the heavy gates slowly opened, revealing them to the waiting crowd. "Alexander Reynolds, who is she?" one reporter shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Is this a publicity stunt? Did you marry her to defy your family?" The questions came like bullets, relentless and unforgiving. Alexander raised his chin, his expression carved from stone, radiating an aura of power and defiance. "This is my wife," he declared, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the cacophony of noise. "That's all you need to know," Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand taller, though her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to betray her fear. The flashes from the cameras burned her eyes, blinding and disorienting, but she refused to flinch, refusing to let them see her break. Hours later, after the press had been forcibly pushed back beyond the gates, the mansion returned to a strained, uneasy silence. Emma sat alone in the library, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, seeking refuge among the towering shelves filled with forgotten stories. She opened to a new page and began to draw, her hand moving almost automatically. Not houses this time, not gardens, not scenes of idyllic domesticity. Instead, she sketched herself as she had appeared at the breakfast table that morning, surrounded by cold, judgmental eyes and sharp, cutting words, a small, vulnerable figure, struggling not to disappear completely. Alexander entered the library quietly, his presence barely noticeable. His gaze fell on her drawing, and for the first time he seemed to see beyond her fragile exterior, beyond the facade of the homeless girl he thought he had rescued. He saw resilience, strength, a quiet determination to survive against all odds. "You draw what you feel," he said softly, his voice filled with understanding. Emma nodded slowly, without looking up from her drawing. "If I don't," she whispered, "the weight of it stays locked inside, crushing me from the inside out." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, their eyes finally meeting. For a long moment, they shared a silence that felt heavier than any words, a silence filled with unspoken emotions and shared understanding. Finally, Alexander spoke, breaking the tension that hung heavy in the air. "I can't undo the cruelty of this house," he said, his voice sincere. "But I won't let them break you. I promise you that." Emma's eyes lifted to his, searching his face for any sign of deception. She had heard many men make promises in her life, but most of them had been empty. Hollow words, spoken without meaning. Yet something in his tone, something steady and raw, stirred a part of her she thought had long gone numb, a flicker of hope in the darkness. That night, the grand estate hosted another formal dinner, a lavish affair designed to impress and intimidate. Family members, close friends, powerful investors, and other members of the city's elite gathered, each one eager to scrutinize Alexander's shocking choice of bride, to assess her worth, and to determine whether she was a threat to their carefully constructed world. Emma was dressed in a stunning gown borrowed from the family's extensive collection, its silk heavy and luxurious against her skin. But the beauty of the gown did little to ease her anxiety. The whispers began the moment she entered the room, a low, insidious hum of judgment that followed her every move. "Look at her shoes," one guest hissed. "She can't even hold her glass properly. What was he thinking?" Emma's cheeks burned with shame, her fingers tightening around her small clutch purse. She desperately wanted to disappear, to melt into the crowd and become invisible once more, but the crowd refused to let her. She was the main attraction, the object of their curiosity and their scorn. At the center table, a woman dripping with diamonds leaned close to Alexander's mother, her voice deliberately loud enough for Emma to hear. "Surely this marriage won't last," she said, her lips curled into a sneer. "She doesn't belong in this world." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. Her stomach twisted with anxiety, and a wave of overwhelming shame washed over her. She excused herself abruptly, escaping into the relative solitude of the hallway, seeking refuge from the relentless judgment. She didn't realize that Alexander had followed her, his concern evident in his eyes. He found her standing near the grand staircase, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You heard them," he said quietly, his voice filled with empathy. Emma forced a shaky laugh, trying to dismiss the hurt. "They're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't belong here. I'm a fraud, a charlatan dressed in silk." Alexander stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "Don't ever say that again," he said, his gaze unwavering. "You're more genuine, more real than any of them in that room. And as long as you wear this ring," he glanced down at her hand, at the small, cheap band that symbolized their unlikely union, "you're my wife. That alone makes you belong." Her breath caught in her throat, his words piercing through the walls she had built around herself to survive, chipping away at her fear and insecurity. For a fleeting moment, standing in the shadows of the grand hallway, Emma felt something dangerous, something she had tried to suppress for so long. The spark of believing him, the forbidden hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be real. Neither of them knew that that small spark would soon ignite a fire, a consuming passion that neither contract nor circumstance could contain. The following days unfolded like a gathering storm, the tension building with each passing hour. Newspapers splashed Alexander's sudden marriage across their front pages, fueling the public's fascination and speculation. Headlines speculated wildly about Emma's past, her motives, her true worth, painting her in a variety of unflattering lights. Some called her a gold digger, a cunning manipulator who had snared a wealthy heir. Others labeled her a mystery, an enigma they were determined to solve. None of them called her what she truly was, a woman who had simply been surviving, doing what she needed to do to get by, until fate, in its infinite unpredictability, had dragged her into the center of a war she never asked for and was ill-equipped to fight. Alexander's family did not remain silent, content to watch from the sidelines. Lawyers arrived at the mansion, papers in hand, demanding that Emma sign a prenuptial amendment, attempting to protect the family's vast fortune from her grasp. Private investigators were hired, tasked with digging into Emma's background, searching for any damaging information that could discredit her and justify annulling the marriage. Every day, she felt their scrutiny like a spotlight burning her skin, exposing her secrets and vulnerabilities to the world. One morning, Emma found a newspaper deliberately placed on the breakfast table, its message clear. Her face was plastered across the front page beneath a cruel, sensationalized headline: "Street Rat Becomes Millionaire's Bride." The photograph showed her stepping out of the limousine on her wedding night, her borrowed gown wrinkled and ill-fitting under the harsh glare of the cameras, her expression a mixture of fear and bewilderment. She gripped the paper until her knuckles turned white, struggling to contain her anger and humiliation. "Don't read that garbage," Alexander said sharply, snatching the paper away and tossing it onto the floor. His voice carried a note of barely suppressed anger, but his eyes revealed something softer: concern, a genuine desire to protect her. "They'll twist every detail, exaggerate every flaw, to break you down, to make you question your worth. You can't let them win." Emma swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "They won't need to twist much," she said quietly, her voice tinged with resignation. "I have nothing to hide, but I have nothing to defend myself with either." Later that week, they attended a charity gala, another obligatory event designed to showcase the Reynolds' wealth, influence, and social standing. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the sweet scent of expensive perfume, and every guest arrived dressed to impress, their attire a testament to their affluence. Emma felt every stare pierce her skin as she walked beside Alexander, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. She tried to carry herself with dignity, but the whispers followed her like shadows, a constant reminder of her unworthiness. "She can't possibly know which fork to use," one guest murmured. "Look at the way she walks. She's not refined. She'll embarrass him." Emma lowered her gaze, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks, burning with shame. But Alexander noticed her discomfort, sensing her vulnerability. He reached for her hand, holding it firmly in his, a deliberate gesture of defiance in front of everyone. Gasps of shock and disapproval rippled through the crowd, their reactions a testament to their disdain. "She's my wife," Alexander said, his voice strong enough to cut through the gossip and the music, silencing the room. "And I won't hear another word against her. Is that understood?" For a moment, complete silence swallowed the room, the only sound the faint hum of the chandeliers. Emma looked up at him, her chest tightening with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She had never been defended like that before, so fiercely, so publicly. But the victory was short-lived, a fleeting moment of triumph in a long and arduous battle. An investor, a man whose financial support was crucial to the Reynolds' ongoing projects, approached Alexander later in the evening, his voice laced with thinly veiled warning. "If you want your projects funded, if you want to maintain our partnership, you'll think twice about parading her around like this," he said, his gaze dismissive as he glanced at Emma. "She's costing you credibility, damaging your reputation." Alexander's jaw clenched, his anger barely contained. "Then I'll fund it myself," he retorted, his voice sharp. The man laughed, clearly dismissing the threat, but Alexander's eyes burned with defiance, unwavering in their resolve. That night, back at the mansion, Emma sat alone in the library, tracing the edges of her sketchbook, her mind heavy with thoughts and emotions she couldn't quite articulate. When Alexander entered, she spoke without lifting her head, her voice barely audible. "You shouldn't keep defending me," she said, her words laced with regret. "It will cost you everything." Alexander crossed the room and sat down across from her, his expression serious. His voice was quiet but steady, filled with sincerity. "Do you think I measure my worth by their approval?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "They only respect money and bloodlines, superficial things. I respect character, strength, resilience, and I've seen yours. You have more of those qualities than anyone I know." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she finally looked up at him, her heart aching with a confusing mix of emotions. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice filled with confusion. "This was supposed to be an arrangement, a business deal, nothing more." Alexander leaned forward, his expression unguarded for the first time, his voice filled with a raw honesty that she had never expected. "Because somewhere between the contract and the chaos, I stopped seeing this as just a performance," he confessed, his gaze intense. "I don't care what they think, what they say about you. I only care about you, about protecting you." Emma's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest as if the walls around it were cracking, allowing a forbidden hope to seep through. She desperately wanted to believe him, to trust in the sincerity of his words. But fear still lingered, a nagging doubt that threatened to undermine her newfound hope. The fear that this fragile bond, this improbable connection could shatter at any moment under the immense weight of a world determined to tear them apart. And yet, as she sat with him in the quiet glow of the library lamps, sharing a silence that was both comforting and unnerving, the line between their carefully constructed agreement and something real, something far more dangerous, blurred even further, becoming almost indistinguishable. The contract had brought them together, but it was no longer the contract that kept them there, binding them to each other in this strange, improbable union. The night of the Foundation Gala finally arrived. A grand event hosted on the sprawling grounds of the Reynolds estate. A glittering showcase of wealth, influence, and family legacy. The ballroom glittered under the light of countless chandeliers, violins swelled with elegant melodies, and every guest arrived dressed to impress, their attire reflecting their status in the city's social hierarchy. Emma, wearing a breathtaking gown that Alexander had personally chosen for her, walked beside him with her head held high, trying to project an air of confidence despite the dread that churned in her stomach. She had endured enough whispers and sidelong glances to know what awaited her here, the gauntlet of judgment she would have to run. The moment they entered the ballroom, conversations hushed, the elegant murmur replaced by the almost imperceptible flicker of judgmental eyes, each one scrutinizing her, assessing her worthiness, and finding her lacking. Emma felt her skin prickle, as though she had stepped into a den of predators, each guest a potential threat. She clutched her small clutch purse tightly, whispering silent affirmations to herself, reminding herself that she was strong, that she would endure just as she always had. Alexander leaned closer, his voice a low murmur in her ear, offering silent support. "Ignore them," he instructed, his gaze reassuring. "You're here because you belong at my side. Remember that." But as the evening stretched on, the subtle cruelty intensified, becoming more overt, more difficult to ignore. A wealthy socialite brushed past Emma, her perfume suffocating, her words deliberately loud, intended for Emma to overhear. "Imagine trading champagne for street corners," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "How romantic." Laughter followed, a sound like glass shattering against stone, sharp and unforgiving. Emma's face burned with shame, but she said nothing, refusing to react, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had promised herself she wouldn't give them that power. Later, while Alexander was pulled aside by a group of powerful investors, Emma found herself standing alone near the refreshment table, feeling isolated and vulnerable. A man in a perfectly tailored suit, his smile oily with malice, approached her, his eyes cold and assessing. He swirled the wine in his glass, studying her with a sneering gaze. "So," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this is the girl who trapped the Reynolds heir. Tell me, how much was your price? A warm bed? A roof over your head? Freedom from sleeping on the streets?" Emma stiffened, her fingers gripping the edge of the table for support. She desperately wanted to walk away, to escape his cruel taunts. But the man's words had hooked into her, striking at her deepest insecurities. "Do you even know which fork to use?" he pressed, his voice laced with mockery. "You're a fraud, a pretender wearing borrowed silk." The laughter around them grew louder, more brazen, fueled by the man's cruelty. Emma's throat tightened, choking her, humiliation crushing her chest. She felt as though she were drowning, suffocating under the weight of their judgment. Then, suddenly, Alexander's voice cut through the noise, silencing the laughter and the whispers with its strength and authority. "Enough!" The crowd turned, their attention drawn to Alexander, who stood at the edge of the gathering, his expression sharp as steel, his eyes blazing with anger. He strode forward, his gaze locked on the man who had been mocking her, his anger radiating outward like a palpable force. "She's my wife," Alexander declared, his voice echoing across the ballroom, silencing the room. "And no one, not one of you, has the right to belittle her, to treat her with disrespect." The ballroom fell silent, the air thick with tension. For a heartbeat, all that existed was Alexander's barely contained fury, and Emma's trembling form, caught in the crossfire of their silent battle. The man tried to laugh it off, attempting to dismiss Alexander. Standing beneath the estate's radiant lanterns, Emma came to the stark realization that their initial bargain had morphed into something profoundly real, undeniably perilous, and from which neither of them could easily break free. The morning following the lavish gala, Emma was roused from her slumber by the faint sounds of voices echoing down the long hallway. She quietly slipped out of her room, her bare feet padding softly against the cool marble floor, and cautiously followed the muffled sounds until she reached Alexander's study. The imposing door was slightly ajar, and from within she could distinctly hear his mother's voice, sharp and cutting like a honed blade. "You have humiliated this family, Alexander. Do you even begin to grasp the magnitude of what you've done? Our reputation is now in tatters, all because of that girl." Emma froze, her stomach twisting into a knot of apprehension. Alexander's response followed, his tone low but unwavering. "I will not apologize. I made my choice, and that choice is mine alone to make, not yours. You're throwing away generations of legacy for a girl who has absolutely nothing." Emma instinctively pressed a hand against her chest, as if the stinging words had been directly aimed at her heart. Unable to bear hearing any more, she turned and quickly retreated. Seeking solace in the quiet sanctuary of the library, she settled at the long wooden table and opened her sketchbook. Her hands trembled slightly as she sketched lines that gradually formed the shape of a small, cozy house. A simple life, a dream she had long since buried deep within her heart. A tear escaped and slid down her cheek, smudging the delicate pencil strokes on the page. The door creaked open, and Alexander entered the library. He paused momentarily when he noticed the sketchbook in front of her. "Emma," he said softly, "what are you drawing?" She quickly closed the sketchbook, clutching it protectively to her chest. "Nothing, just dreams that don't belong here." He took a step closer, his gaze softening with concern. "Dreams always belong, especially yours." For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe him. But later that day, as the household staff bustled about and the press swarmed outside the estate gates, a distinct knock echoed at the front door. An older man stood there, his face weathered by time and hardship, his eyes brimming with a mixture of both relief and profound sorrow. "Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion when he saw her. Emma froze, her breath catching sharply in her throat. "Father." The room fell into an immediate hush. Alexander's eyes darted back and forth between them, a look of shock flickering across his face. The man stepped forward, tears now visibly streaking down his cheeks. "I thought I had lost you forever." Whispers rippled through the assembled staff. Emma's long-hidden past had suddenly surfaced, revealing itself in an instant. She wasn't merely a homeless girl plucked from the streets. She was, in fact, the daughter of a once renowned artist who had mysteriously vanished after a tragic event struck their family. Alexander's mind reeled with the revelation. The woman he thought he had rescued carried a story far more profound and complex than he could have ever imagined. Emma's hands trembled uncontrollably as she reached out to her father. "Why now?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "Because I have finally found the strength to face the world again, and I couldn't bear to let you live unseen any longer." The sketchbook slipped from her grasp, falling open onto the floor. Pages filled with drawings spilled out, revealing dreams of warm, inviting homes, lush gardens, and loving families. It was undeniable proof that even in her darkest and most desperate days, she had never stopped yearning for something more than mere survival. Alexander bent down to pick up the sketchbook, his fingers gently brushing against the delicate pages. He looked up at Emma, a new light in his eyes. It wasn't pity or obligation, but a sense of awe and profound respect. The girl he thought he had married out of desperation was far more extraordinary than he had ever realized, and her truth would undoubtedly change everything. The days that followed Emma's reunion with her father brought more tension and unease than genuine relief. The revelation of her hidden identity spread quickly, carried by hushed whispers among the staff, and eventually reaching the ears of the Reynolds family council. To them, Emma was no longer simply a homeless girl. They now saw her as the daughter of a man who had once been celebrated, but who had also been embroiled in scandal. The past was being relentlessly dredged up and twisted into ammunition against her. One evening, Alexander was summoned to a private meeting with his parents and several of their closest advisors. Emma stood anxiously outside the study, listening as the muffled voices gradually rose into heated arguments. "This cannot continue," his father declared emphatically. "The girl's history is a liability. Investors are growing increasingly nervous, and our reputation is teetering on the brink of collapse." Alexander's voice rang out, distinct, unwavering and resolute. "You're wrong. What truly ruins reputations is cowardice. What strengthens them is courage, and I will not abandon her." "Oh, you will destroy everything we've built," his mother snapped back, her voice dripping with disdain. "If it was built on oppression and manipulation, then it deserves to fall," Alexander retorted sharply. The door suddenly swung open, and Alexander stormed out of the study, his jaw tight with anger, his eyes burning with defiance. Emma was waiting just outside, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. He paused, looking at her as if she were the only stable anchor in a turbulent sea of chaos. "They want me to choose," he said quietly, his voice filled with resignation. "Them or you?" Emma's chest ached with a deep, gnawing pain. "And what will you choose?" "There is no choice," Alexander answered firmly, his voice unwavering. "I choose you." But despite his resolute words, Emma saw the storm raging in his eyes. She knew the immense cost of that choice. His inheritance, his company, and his very future all hung precariously in the balance. She couldn't bear the thought of him sacrificing everything because of her. That night, while he slept soundly in his room across the hall, Emma sat on the edge of her bed, tightly clutching her cherished sketchbook. She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "Maybe the kindest thing I can do is leave." Her father found her there, her face pale and drawn under the soft moonlight streaming through the tall windows. He placed a trembling hand gently on her shoulder. "Emma, you've always carried far too much alone. But running away won't protect him. Standing by his side will." Tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Her father's voice was soft but firm, filled with unwavering conviction. "Strength isn't about never breaking. It's about breaking and finding the courage to stand again." The following day, Alexander faced the Reynolds board in a room filled with sharp suits and even colder eyes. Emma stood resolutely beside him, despite the insistent voices in her head urging her to simply disappear. "This marriage is a mistake," one advisor sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Annul it now, and perhaps the damage can be contained." Alexander rose to his feet, firmly clasping Emma's hand in his. "I will not annul it. I will not turn my back on her. If you want a Reynolds heir who bows to pressure, then find someone else. But if you want a leader who stands by his principles, then understand this. Emma stays." Gasps of shock and disbelief echoed around the room. His parents glared at him, their carefully constructed empire seemingly slipping from their grasp. But Alexander's voice did not falter, remaining strong and resolute. "I will build something new, something honest, even if I must do it without your fortune." The meeting ended in utter chaos, with voices clashing like thunder. But as they left the room together, Alexander squeezed Emma's hand reassuringly. She looked up at him, her chest heavy with both fear and a fragile sense of hope. Outside the mansion, the press waited like vultures, eagerly anticipating a sensational headline. Alexander stepped forward boldly, pulling Emma with him, and faced the flashing cameras head-on. "This is my wife," he declared once more, his voice carrying clearly over the cacophony of noise, "and no amount of power, money, or threats will ever make me forsake her." Emma stood beside him, trembling slightly, yet feeling stronger and more empowered than she had ever felt before. For the first time in her life, she wasn't merely surviving in the shadows, she was standing proudly in the light by his side, unhidden and unafraid. But even as the crowd roared with questions, Emma knew that the battle was far from over. The Reynolds empire would not surrender quietly, and the hardest fight was undoubtedly yet to come. The storm that had threatened to tear them apart reached its breaking point. For weeks, Alexander and Emma lived under siege. Paparazzi relentlessly camped outside the gates, investors pulled out of crucial deals, and his parents waged a relentless and deeply personal campaign to undermine their marriage. But instead of succumbing to the pressure, Alexander grew even stronger and more determined. And Emma, once invisible and perpetually afraid, discovered her own voice and inner strength. One evening, the Reynolds family hosted a highly publicized press conference, ostensibly meant to restore their tarnished public image. Their true plan, however, was clear: to pressure Alexander into announcing the annulment of his marriage to Emma. The ballroom was filled with flashing lights, reporters eager to seize upon any hint of scandal, and the family council seated like stern judges, ready to witness a spectacular downfall. Emma stood just behind Alexander, her palms damp with nervous sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was the defining moment when everything would ultimately be decided. His mother spoke first, her tone as smooth as silk, but as sharp and cutting as glass. "We are gathered here today to clarify certain misunderstandings regarding my son's recent impulsive actions." But before she could continue, Alexander stepped forward, interrupting her. His voice rang out across the hall, steady and defiant. "There are no misunderstandings. I married Emma. She is my wife, and I will not allow anyone to diminish her dignity." Gasps of shock and outrage echoed through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. He reached for Emma's hand and drew her forward, placing her firmly at his side before the entire world. For far too long, power and wealth have been treated as far more valuable than character. But I have learned that true strength lies in compassion, integrity, and the unwavering courage to stand up for what is right. Emma has shown me that. Emma felt her chest swell with an overwhelming surge of emotion. Her life had been marked by profound loss, by invisibility, and by a constant struggle for survival on the cold, unforgiving streets. And now, this man, the heir to a vast empire, was boldly telling the world that she was worthy. Reporters shouted questions, some cruel and accusatory, others merely curious. One particularly brazen reporter called out, "What about your fortune, Mr. Reynolds? Are you willing to lose everything for her?" Alexander did not hesitate for even a moment. "If wealth demands that I betray my wife, then it is simply not worth having. I would rather build a new legacy with her by my side than inherit a kingdom built on lies." The words sent shockwaves throughout the room. His parents' faces visibly paled, their carefully maintained control slipping away right before the cameras. Emma's throat tightened with emotion. She turned to him, whispering through tears. "You'll lose everything," Alexander smiled faintly, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "Not everything, not you." The crowd erupted in a cacophony of noise, some expressing outrage, others breaking into spontaneous applause. The world was watching, and in that defining moment the truth could no longer be silenced. Weeks later, the atmosphere in the mansion felt palpably different. Alexander had bravely stepped down from the family's vast empire, choosing instead to start a smaller firm of his own, surrounded by allies who genuinely believed in his vision. The estate no longer buzzed with hostile advisors or cold, impersonal commands. It finally felt like a real home. Emma walked peacefully through the garden one afternoon, the simple, inexpensive silver ring still shining brightly on her finger. She carried her cherished sketchbook under her arm. Alexander joined her, gently slipping his hand into hers. "You never showed me your latest drawing," he said softly. She opened the sketchbook, revealing a sketch of the two of them standing in front of a modest house with a welcoming porch, flowers blooming vibrantly in the yard, and children playing happily nearby. It wasn't a depiction of marble halls or glittering chandeliers. It was a heartfelt dream of a real home, filled with love and warmth. Alexander's eyes softened with emotion. "Then let us build this together." Emma's heart swelled, tears blurring her vision. "No contracts, no pretenses, just us." He kissed her forehead tenderly. "Just us." The story that began as a desperate escape and a fake marriage ended not in scandal and ruin, but in a truth far more profound and enduring than any fortune. For Alexander and Emma, love had become their greatest act of rebellion and their most unshakable vow.